Okay, well, welcome. Here we are at our fall conference. We're glad you're here. We're in our wonderful breakout session, Fix Our Forest Act from Skepticism to Support. And I am going to introduce our speakers. So, first, we have James Campbell, who is the Director of Federal Affairs and Strategic Counsel with Megafire Action. He engages in direct advocacy, navigating complex policy changes, regulatory law, and shifting political landscapes to advance solutions to the megafire crisis. James earned his JD from the American University Washington College of Law. He was also a wildfire policy specialist with the Climate and Environment team at the Federation of American Scientists and a law clerk in the office of Senator Ed Markey. So we're glad James is here. Also presenting is Dana Nuccitelli, who is, as you all know, an environmental scientist and climate journalist with a master's degree in physics. Dana has written about climate change since 2010 for Skeptical Science and for The Guardian from 2013 to 2018, and since 2018 for Yale Climate Connections. In 2015, Dana published the book Climatology versus Pseudoscience, and he has also authored 10 peer-reviewed climate studies, including a 2013 paper that found a 97% consensus among peer-reviewed climate science research that humans are the primary cause of global warming. Dana joined our CCL staff in 2021 after 9 years as a volunteer with our Sacramento chapter. And during that time, he gave dozens of presentations all around California about climate change impacts like wildfires and droughts and policy solutions like carbon fee and dividend. And Dana has led our CCL science policy team since 2017. And he's also the winner of numerous prestigious journalism awards, including the SEAL Environmental Journalism Award in 2022 and National Center for Science Education Friend of the Planet Award in 2016. So welcome, presenters. I'm going to turn it over to Dana.
Thanks, Allie, and welcome everybody to probably the best breakout session today. I think you made a good choice coming here to learn some more about the Fix Our Forest Act. So I'm going to start off talking about a little bit of scientific background on worsening wildfires and treatments. James, our great guest, is going to talk a little bit about Megafire, his organization, and some details about the bill and its benefits. Then we're going to go over some of the common concerns that have been raised about the bill. We addressed some of these in our FOFA concerns document that Karina will link in the chat. And then should have plenty of time for Q&A. So as questions come up, please put them in the Q&A button and also upvote the questions that you think you would most like to hear us answer, because the most upvoted questions are probably going to get answered first. So my favorite part, of course, looking at what the science says about wildfires and treatments. So this is a chart showing the acreage burned by wildfires in the entire United States every year over the past 40 years. You can see lots and lots of variability, because some years the weather happens to be wetter and colder, other years it happens to be hotter and drier. But this is the long-term trend line going up and up and up. In the 1980s, we would usually get about 2 million acres burned per year. Now we're in the range of often 6 million to 10 million acres burned per year. So a really rapid rise in the growth of these fires and these really big mega fires. So why is that happening? There's kind of two main categories. Of course, climate change causing conditions in general, especially in the Southwest, to be hotter and drier, and thus creating conditions for wildfires to spread really fast. And of course, we're trying to address climate change through lots of our different policy areas. But there's also forest management. And so there was a really good paper looking at why this problem is worsening from a forest management perspective, published a few years ago. It found that, for example, colonialism replacing indigenous cultural burning of forests is a big contributing factor. Over the past 100 years, we've engaged in very aggressive fire suppression. Every time we would see a wildfire, we would put it out as quickly as possible, and so not allowing these natural fires to burn, and also some early timber harvest practices that removed large trees. So this has resulted in much denser forests. You can see some data on the right here. This is a survey of some forests in California. The light green is the tree density, trees per hectare historically, and then the dark green is the current tree density. So you can see, on average, California forests are about 3 times more dense with trees and vegetation than they were in the historical past. And so that combination of hotter and drier and denser forests creates the conditions for these mega fires. Once the fire sparks, it can really just burn out of control with all this hot, dry, dense material available to burn, and then it gets really hard to get those fires under control. In 2016, there was a really good paper that looked at the contribution of these different factors. And so what we're looking at here is the cumulative area burned in southwestern forests. In the yellow, how much would have burned in the absence of human-caused climate change. In the orange is the additional area that burned because of human-caused climate change. So the paper estimated that human-caused climate change roughly doubled the acreage burned in western forests over the past 30 years or so. So human-caused climate change is a big factor, but it's not the only factor. There is also that forest management factor, which is what we're trying to address with the Fix Our Forests Act. And so one of the ways we're trying to do that is with these wildfire fuel treatment procedures, which is primarily prescribed burns and thinning. And there's been lots of good studies showing that these approaches, when done correctly, are effective. There was just this year a meta-analysis published, which is an analysis looking at a bunch of different papers from the past, looking at the efficacy of prescribed burning or mechanical thinning or both. And what they found was that if you do this and you do it well, you reduce the reductions in wildfire severity by between 62% and 72% relative to untreated areas. They had some nice pictures that we got on the right of the slide here, kind of showing that. The top one is untreated forests, and so you can see there's like very dense, kind of low and middle and high level vegetation. And so those middle height vegetation, we call those ladder fuels that can kind of transport the embers up into the canopy of the big trees. And so then what happens is you get a lot of burning, and the forest doesn't end up doing very well. Lots of it burns down because the fire spreads into the canopy and it gets really dense or really intense. Whereas if you do thinning and or prescribed burns, it does much better. And the best approach is to do both thinning and prescribed burns. Then the flames tend to stay on the surface level. They don't get up into the canopy of the trees, and many more of the trees survive as a result. And there was a 2023 study that found that controlled burns and or thinning, very similarly, after a 20-year period of study that they looked at, those plots that had both and or prescribed burning and or thinning did much, much better, much more resistant to wildfire than untreated sections. So very similar results, finding that forest thinning can be a viable way to mitigate fire risk as long as it's done in a good way, sustainably. So that's, of course, important, is to implement these practices in a scientifically sound, sustainable way. And so we've also got data looking at these in practice. This is from CAL FIRE, which is the organization in California that does firefighting. So basically over the past year or so, they've looked at a bunch of treatment areas, about 100 wildfire fuel treatment areas, and looked at fires that kind of approach those areas. And they found that the vast majority of these, they had positive impacts. They would change the fire behavior. They were able to contain the fires much more frequently. They reduced the damage that was caused by the wildfires in these areas that had been treated for wildfire fuel reductions. So it kind of shows that these projects that are doing prescribed burns and thinning they're doing a good job. They're effective at reducing these extreme megafires. And then we also have an important success story, because one of the things that FOFA does, it expands the categorical exclusion for these wildfire fuel treatment projects, which a categorical exclusion is sort of like, it's a part of the NEPA process, but it's a less detailed environmental assessment than an environmental assessment or an environmental impact report, which are much, much more detailed. So a categorical exclusion, you're still going through the NEPA process, you're still considering environmental impacts, it's just takes less time. And so currently in the law, we have this 3,000 acre categorical exclusion for wildfire treatment projects. Fix Our Forest Act wants to expand that to 10,000 acres. And we did this once before in the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act in 2016, I believe, 2015 or 2016, where they said South Lake Tahoe gets this 10,000 acre categorical exclusion because there was a lot of concerns that, it's right up against the forest, that if there were a big fire, it could burn through South Lake Tahoe, the city, and do a lot of damage. And so you can see on this map the resulting fuel treatments, prescribed burns and/or thinning that happened as a result of that 10,000 acre categorical exclusion. And then in 2021, you can see this red here is the Caldor fire that was burning through the adjacent forest and approaching South Lake Tahoe. And you can see the fire basically was stopped by these fuel treatments working as they should. They were able to get the fire out of control and, effectively save the city of South Lake Tahoe with the assistance of this this 10,000 acre categorical exclusion fuel treatment. So it's a good real world example of this sort of thing being effective. So now I'm going to hand it over to James. And James, feel free to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dana. And before I go ahead and share my slide, I just want to thank everybody as well for coming out on this Saturday and being able to hear from me and all the CCL people. I will say that CCL has been an amazing partner on FOFA, and all of you participating and engaging in this process has really helped us get over the line in the Senate Agriculture Committee. And looking forward to hopefully eventually getting this out of the Senate, passed again in the House. So just want to say thank you so much for all the work that you guys have been doing and will continue to do. I'm James Campbell with Megafire Action, Director of Federal Affairs and Strategic Counsel here. As previously mentioned, I come from the Federation of American Scientists, where I was a wildfire policy specialist. Previously used to work with Senator Markey, and also before that, I worked with then Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who went on to become our great Secretary of the Interior, originally from New Mexico, grew up with wildfires. Our organization is a really small organization of around 7 people. I'm the only one who does full-time federal affairs work, but our founder and CEO, Matt Weiner, worked for California Democrats for the past 15 years before starting this organization in 2022. Our entire mission is to end the Megafire crisis within 10 years. So we're trying to put ourselves out of business. We're a few years into that. By 2032, we hope to have a handle on the Megafire crisis. I think that there's really, a few things about why Megafire Action exists. We believe that wildfire policy has failed in the past 20 to 50 years to actually tackle this problem. We know that as climate change has exacerbated wildfires, is exacerbated the amount of destruction that they cause. So we believe that a new fire regime is needed to tackle a new and changing climate. We know that wildfire is not all bad. Wildfire is natural, just like the rain. When rain comes, we love it. Too much rain, you get flooding. When wildfire comes, it is good for the environment as well. Too much wildfire, too catastrophic, you're going to get megafires. And we define megafires not as the traditional 100,000 acre plus, but we define it as anything that causes severe and catastrophic damage to people, their lives, their livelihoods, or communities. So, and a good example of this is the Los Angeles fires. Those were not a fire that hit 100,000 acres. It was very small acreage impacted, but it was catastrophic damage to people's lives, livelihoods, and the community. So we would define the LA fires, Palisades, and Altadena fires as megafires, even though it was a very small amount of acreage actually impacted. So we also have been advocating from the Fix Our Forest Act from the very beginning. And I will say when we first engaged with Chairman Westerman, we looked at that bill and we were like, how hard are we going to oppose this bill? But instead of going into that office and saying that we are going to flat out oppose it and fight back with them, we said, hey, we see what you're trying to do here. Let us help you. Let's engage in an iterative and interesting process to actually move this thing forward and see if we can create a piece of legislation that actually makes a difference. And to Chairman Westerman's credit, they reached out, grabbed our hand, and said, okay, let's do this. And we worked with them over the past 2 years to really craft a piece of legislation that has then moved over to the Senate and gotten even better thanks to Senators Padilla, Hickenlooper, Curtis, and Sheehy. And we're really proud of this piece of legislation that has ended up. I will say that FOFA really tackles three main problems. And then after this, Dana, I'll turn it back over to you. But three main problems and the things that it's trying to fix with our wildfire regime. The first is it wants to modernize the way we manage our forests. There are still some forest managers using pen and paper and mapping it in a very physical and manual way when we have the technology right now to understand fire, how it's going to react, how smoke is going to react, what we can do to pre-position fire assets to prevent catastrophic wildfires. So we want to modernize the way that we're doing forest management and make sure we're augmenting our workforce to make sure they have the tools to actually do it in an effective and safe way. We also are very excited about the creation of the Wildfire Intelligence Center, which would be a new joint office run by the Forest Service and the Department of Interior to essentially create a national center, a national hub for intelligence, predicting fire, coordinating fire, and response. We like to say that it is a center for decision support making across all levels of government, tackling all stages of fire. And we're super excited for that. And that's been something that Megafire Action has been really engaged in. And then the last thing is that, the Fix Our Forest Act really prioritizes the bioeconomy. It's incredibly expensive to do this work on the ground. We need to be thinking about ways to do it smarter, more efficiently, cheaper, and also making sure that we're protecting our future economy as well. And this is not just removing fuels from our forests and figuring out a way to sell it. It's about protecting our recreation economy, protecting our national parks and our forests in places like South Lake Tahoe, where people go to recreate, enjoy time with their families, and also just be out in nature. These are all three main goals with the Fix Our Forests Act, and Make Fire Action is proud to engage with CCL on this, and we're looking forward to dispelling some of the myths that have popped up around this bill. And I will say, as a diehard environmentalist, I didn't think I'd be working with Bruce Westerman on a bill that I think is going to improve the climate, but sometimes you end up with strange bedfellows. Thank you so much for hearing me talk, and I'll get those slides out next time. Maybe I should update my Zoom before joining next time.
Yeah, no worries. We can make sure to share the link to your slides with our volunteers at a later date. Yeah, thanks. That was a great introduction and overview and a nice segue. We wanted to address some of those common concerns that you raised about the bill. So we've got 5 of these concerns that we're going to go through. And then after we talk about those, we'll open it up to audience questions. So again, remember to use that Q&A button and also upvote the questions that you want us to answer once we're finished with these common concerns. So first one, kind of the main one that often comes up is, will FOFA open up the floodgates to industrial logging and clear cutting across millions of acres of our national forests? And I kind of just copied these from concerns that I saw from organizations in various areas of the internet and emails and whatnot. So James, you want to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this flat out no. No, this will not open up the floodgates for clear cutting and logging across millions of acres of our national forests. If you search through the bill, not once is logging mentioned, and all of the base statutes that expand the categorical exclusions from 3,000 to 10,000 acres, all of those categorical exclusions are based in statute that requires public notice, that requires tribal notice, that allows for the public to engage in this. And any removal of trees is going to be selective thinning. The whole creation of FOFA is really based in advancing wildfire resilience projects. So if you're not able to demonstrate that a project, so the Forest Service say they want to, designate a fire shed and engage in a project under FOFA, if they're not able to say that what they're going to do is actually going to build wildfire resilience, then they are not allowed to do that under FOFA. And the science is very clear, and they're required to look at the best available science in the bill that clear cutting and logging does not build wildfire resilience. It actually exacerbates wildfire risk. So flat out, they are not able to do that.
Yeah, really good answer. And that kind of points to the way that I like to answer this question too, is to look at the text and like the way that we're expanding that categorical exclusion that we've been talking about from 3,000 acres to 10,000 acres is through this previous bill, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And so you can see like at the bottom of this text from the bill, this is where it had the 3,000 acre categorical exclusion, which FOFA then amends to 10,000 acres. So in these wildfire resilience projects, the text that's still going to remain unchanged is that these wildfire fuel reduction projects have to maximize the retention of old growth and large trees as appropriate for the forest type. They have to consider the best available scientific information, as you said, James, to maintain or restore the ecological integrity of the forest. They have to be developed and implemented through collaborative process. So there's all these criteria in the existing law that still remains the existing law, that you can't just like go through and clear cut a bunch of trees. You have to do this in the right way to consider the science, maintain these trees and ecological integrity as best as possible. So these are kind of the guardrails that are in there to prevent like vast clear cutting from happening. So that was the first concern. Let's move on to the second one. Will FOFA roll back environmental safeguards and protections for endangered species and critical habitats? I think I can take this one. So there's concerns specifically about endangered species and the Endangered Species Act. I think they stem from what's called the Cottonwood Fix in the bill. So this is from in 2015. There was this judicial decision, the Cottonwood decision, essentially the Cottonwood Environmental Law Center, the Forest Service. And basically what that decision said was that the Forest Service, when there is new information about an endangered species in a certain forest area, the Forest Service has to pause the forest management project and reanalyze its entire forest management plan for that entire forest. And so the Forest Service leaders kind of went to Congress and they said, if we have to do this, we're going to have to reevaluate 87 forest plans. It's going to take us up to a decade. In the meantime, we won't be able to do wildfire treatment plans in those entire forests. And that's kind of stymieing any progress that we're trying to make in reducing this fuel density and these wildfire risks. In the meantime, like while they're not doing these fuels reduction projects, there can be mega fires that go through those forests, which that's actually happened a few times. There was actually an example in 2017 in Montana. There was a forest that they were trying to do a forest fuels reduction project, and they got sued because there's some Canada lynx habitat there, and they had to stop. And then later that year, a big mega fire went through, and it basically burned through most of that Canada lynx habitat. And so it's a problem that you can kind of like, the intent is to protect the Canada lynx. That's a good intent. We want to do that. But if you're stopping these fuel reductions projects, you can actually be endangering the endangered species even more because you're not able to reduce the wildfire risks that are posed potentially to this endangered species habitat. So it's a tricky thing to balance. And so basically what FOFA does is we call it the Cottonwood Fix, which basically says if there is new endangered species information that arises in a certain area, like if there is a project in that area, you have to consider that new endangered species information. You have to make sure you're minimizing any particular impacts or threats to that endangered species in your forest project. But the entirety of the forest management plan does not have to be redone. So for example, if you've got like a Canada lynx in the southeast corner of a forest, and you're trying to do some wildfire management in the northeast corner, northwest corner of the forest, and then like if that new information arises, then you can still go ahead and do that wildfire fuel management in the northwest corner. But if you're going to do it in the southeast corner, then you have to take that new species information into consideration before you're going to do any projects in that corner. But the rest of the forest, which is not overlapping with that endangered species habitat, the planning and the wildfire fuels reduction projects can continue. So we think that's kind of a reasonable thing to do. You're still making sure to include this information in any relevant projects, preserve these species in those areas, but not stopping the progress that we're trying to make in reducing the wildfire fuels in the rest of the forest that is not impacted by these new endangered species information.
And I would just add one thing here. Megafire is not an organization that engages deeply on the Endangered Species Act, but our perspective is really if we don't get a handle on ending high severity and catastrophic wildfires for these habitats, the animals that are already endangered are going to lose their habitats or burn anyways. And so we're kind of in a bad trade-off here. And we'll also note that a recent study that came out earlier this year shows that the already endangered spotted owl, their habitats that were affected by high severity wildfires were largely abandoned by the spotted owl. So they're not returning to habitats that were impacted by high severity wildfires. So already trying to protect species that are endangered, but not engaging in the forest management projects to protect their habitats, are then leading to those habitats to be wiped out and them abandoning it, which just continues to snowball this entire problem. And I will drop in the chat the link to that study as well for others to be able to pull out.
Cool, thanks. We really appreciate that. We always like any new studies that we can look at, we appreciate. But I think that gets to kind of the overarching issue with FOFA is like the status quo it's problematic. Like the status quo is that we're seeing these big megafires that do intense damage to people, to endangered species, to ecosystems. And, which has kind of reached the point where these megafires have become such a problem that we like the status quo is just not okay. And we have to do something to minimize or reduce these risks that we're facing. And so that's kind of the purpose of FOFA is to change the status quo and address these problems more expediently. Okay, next common concern we're going to talk about, will FOFA shut the public out of decisions about our forests and block citizens' ability to hold the government accountable? James, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a concern that people have brought up to us. I would say it's probably one of the number one concerns that people are brought up. I think that there's two things that I would note here. One is under all of the CEs that are expanded from 3,000 to 10,000 acres, which we think is critically important. And a lot of the wildland firefighters that we work with on the ground, the people who do these forest management projects have said that these are critical and important. All of those CEs that do get expanded in their base text in HIFRA require public notice, require public participation, require the Forest Service or other land management agencies that are going to be doing these projects to work with the public and the communities. That's already required. None of that is being changed in the Fix Our Forests Act. And then we will also say that there's a concern. I think that there's a question about this later on as well, about whether the public is still able to sue to stop these projects. Maybe the Forest Service engages in notice and working with them, and they come to a different conclusion than the community. Absolutely, the public will still be able to sue. It simply changes the statute of limitations from 6 years, which is quite a long time to be investing time, money, and experienced forest managers trying to move a project forward, and still maybe you get sued 5.5 years down the line of implementing this project. It moves it from 6 years to 150 days statute of limitations, which is a dramatic change. However, already the Forest Service has said that almost half of all lawsuits are already being filed within that 150-day period. And as a lawyer myself, I will say that we like to run up against the deadlines. So if lawyers are already suing almost half the time within the new deadline, I think that that is really indicative that like people are not going to be missing out on their chance to be able to sue the Forest Service if they come to a different conclusion. So there are multiple steps in the process that are preserved for the public to be able to engage in these decisions, and also to hold the government accountable when it does make a wrong decision. Those are all really important things to protect, and this bill still protects all of those.
Cool, thanks. That's some really valuable insight. Just to define a couple of those acronyms, CE is categorical exclusion, and HFRA is the Healthy Forest Restoration Act that we were talking about earlier, where those categorical exclusions are expanded from 3,000 to 10,000 acres. Okay, common concern number 4 we've got here. Does FOFA fail to provide any resources and funding for real wildfire solutions like home hardening, defensible space, and community planning? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real concern, and it's something that we wish we were in a different political environment to be able to attach funding directly to the Fix Our Forests Act. I will say that just a few things. One, all of the Senate sponsors, including the Republicans, have asked for appropriations to be attached to the bill. They want it to get funded. They know that the Senate would likely pass it with funding. This is the letter directly from all of the Senate co-sponsors of the bill and the drafters of the bill. However, we know that the dynamics in the House are very different than the dynamics in the Senate. So we have a political problem here, not a policy problem. That's something that we can solve later on. And Megafire Action believes that we would, in the long term, absolutely will fight and to secure funding, and that this is just one step in that process. However, the Fix Our Forest Act does a lot of policy changes that does not need funding to be implemented. So I said one of the main things that we're talking about in this bill is modernizing the way we do forest management. A lot of that is policy changes. It's not so much attaching funding to it. And we know that funding is not going to solve everything. The Forest Service itself got 10 times the amount that it usually gets from bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, and infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act gave Forest Service 10 times its normal annual budget, but they only did 2 times the amount of forest management projects. So we know that there's a policy issue here. They need to be able to engage in faster and more efficient forest management, and that's a policy change. We also see that there are real solutions in the Fix Our Forest Act that would absolutely unlock funding for home hardening, building defensible space, and community planning. One of those changes that I'll highlight is some tweaks to the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program, which has been incredibly and wildly successful for communities across the country. We secured some language in that program that would allow for home hardening to be included in the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program. So now people would be able to access funds directly to harden their homes against wildfires when they previously wouldn't be able to. That unlocks funding for a pretty critical wildfire solution. So it's all of that. And then also the commitment that we will continue to move forward to secure funding for this bill, perhaps when there's a more friendly political environment. I think we have to unfortunately understand that we're in a situation where the House of Representatives and the Senate is rescinding already appropriated funds. So in that type of environment, trying to secure more money is pretty unlikely. So we want to secure the policy changes while we have the chance to do it, and then come back and continue to fight for the funding.
Yeah, lots of very good points there. So I think like one key one is that FOFA does have provisions for things like home hardening and community planning and whatnot. So I think this concern is just saying like there are no funds in the bill specifically earmarked to do this to like fund these kinds of projects. But it's actually, I believe, James, you can like clarify this, but I believe it's a common thing for legislation not to actually include the funding to support it, right?
Yeah, it's very common. I mean, every single senator, every single member of Congress, with maybe the exception of a Rand Paul or a Thomas Massey, have voted for a bill that does not contain funding, but does these types of policy changes, and then later on appropriates funding to those programs. So it's not like if we pass this bill, it will never have funding attached to these programs. Absolutely not. We will continue to fight for it, and a lot of these changes will unlock already existing funding for things that are really critical to keep doing right now.
Yeah, and then this is where the appropriations process comes in that CCL we've previously earlier this year advocated for in the appropriations process, like adequately fully funding the Forest Service. As you mentioned, the four Senate co-sponsors of the bill sent this letter to the chairs of the appropriations committees saying, like, this is really important. Make sure you give the Forest Service the funding so that they can do their job and adequately implement the Fix Our Forest Act once it's passed. So this is kind of the way it's done. Like, we don't necessarily have to include the funding right now as long as we can get it in the appropriations process further down the line. As you mentioned, there's also complications in the House because the House has rules that, like, if they have funding earmarked, then they have to find a pay for it. And so then, like, if you send this bill to the House and saying it has to have funding, then they have to find a pay for it, which adds an extra complication. And so that's like kind of another reason why that was excluded from the bill in the Senate. Okay, our last common concern we want to talk about before we open it up for audience questions. Will FOFA limit the use of science in forest management decision making?
Absolutely not. If you go look at the bill, and search for science, you will find the requirement to use the best available science 19 times in the bill. You'll find logging 0 times, but you will find the requirement to use the best available science for the implementation of these types of projects 19 times. For the bulk of the work that I did around this bill, I was with the Federation of American Scientists, which endorsed the bill. This bill is not only going to require the use of the best available science to actually implement these projects, but was built and embedded with the idea to have science and evidence-based policymaking at its core. It really is something that a number of stakeholders, not just those in Congress, but at CCL, at FAS, Megafire Action, a number of other external stakeholders were looking at the bill with a microscope to ensure that we are going to build a bill that's based in science and based in evidence-based policy. And that's something that we're really proud to have. And it's something that we were really interested and happy to work with the more Republican members on. Even in, I will just give one small example about how this is included. In the bill, there is a pretty wonky biochar demonstration project. Within this biochar demonstration project, one of the criteria for selecting a project to receive whatever funding it does receive for testing this type of material is that it has a carbon sequestration potential. Republicans voted for a bill that would engage biochar for carbon sequestration. I mean, this is something that really hasn't happened in a long time where Republicans are supporting this bill along, hand in hand with a lot of really great and strong Democratic members. So science is not only embedded in this bill, but was looked at at its core to try and inform every step of the way, including some of the most wonky provisions in it as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the biochar provision because like I really love that provision because biochar is like a really cool potential climate solution where you're kind of locking up the carbon in this woody material and then using it for useful purposes. But like the biochar industry just has not been able to get off the ground because it's a new thing. It's got a cost associated with it and it's just really
Mhm.
tricky. And so having like this legislation that potentially gives biochar a little bit of a boost is really good. And if you're thinning out forests and you have all this material that you have to do something with and like kind of the standard practice is just to kind of put it in a pile and burn it, and then the carbon's going into the atmosphere. So if you can actually use it for something useful like biochar that will lock up the carbon, it's a much better solution and a very science-based solution. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent point that to do this forest management projects, some of it is thinning, but as you said, you have to find a way to what do you do with that material? You could either leave it on the forest floor, which then it dries out and actually creates potential for wildfire risk. You could put it in a pile and burn it, which releases the carbon. You could use it to create biochar, which is a material that retains water. It's good for drought resistance. It's sellable. It's something that locks that carbon away instead of releasing it into the air. And there's a lot of stuff in our forest that is not able to be used for wood products. And I think this goes back to our first question about, the concern for clear-cut logging. A lot of the material that needs to be removed from the forest is not usable for logging. It's not sellable. It actually costs a lot of money to go to the forest and remove this stuff. And logging companies, I'll say there's not one logging company that is in support of this bill because it doesn't make them any money. They know that this is not going to be a money-making bill for them because this is really not about having a profit-driven motive. It's at its core trying to create a different way that we deal with the catastrophic wildfire crisis. And this is just one of those ways.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I was actually really surprised when I saw this particular concern because as you mentioned, like science is all over the Fix Our Forest Act. It's
Mhm.
one reason I like the bill is because it's all about like considering the science to reduce, these wildfire risks, and it's all over the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which is referenced and amended by FOFA. So yeah, I was surprised that somebody was arguing that it's limiting the use of science. It also helps like the changes that the Senate made from the House version, like the new version of the Senate bill and the amendments that were added in by the Senate Agriculture Committee. They further include the use of science. Like there's one amendment that has like regional wildfire intelligence centers or something along those lines, where they get in different regions in universities. They'll set up these institutions that will like they'll gather information from state experts and federal experts,
Yeah.
academic experts, and tribal institutions, and like make sure that we're using the best available science.
And I mean, I think that's a great example of how science is embedded in this bill from the very beginning. And I can actually speak to that amendment that was added from Senator Lujan, my home state senator. That idea came from a professor at the University of New Mexico who said, "Hey, we need to deal with wildfires on a regional level. Wildfires in California and Arizona react very different than Oregon and Washington, and very different than Florida or somewhere like Hawaii as well. Those fires are all different, so we need science that studies them on the regional level." He wrote a policy memo, sent it to the Federation of American Scientists, and brought that idea directly to the senators, who then worked with Senator Lujan to secure an amendment. And now that is in the base text of the bill, accepted and voted for by Republicans. All Republicans on committee voted for it. They're very excited as well because they know that that science is going to be really important for their home states like Arkansas or South Dakota or Wyoming, because having that regional based science allows you to tackle it in a different way. So at its core, even that example, came from an idea from a scientist at the University of New Mexico, made it all the way, into the bill and is now embedded in there. And we're going to be really excited to see that implemented.
Yeah, really cool. Thanks for that background. That's really interesting. Yeah, and Senator Lujan, I think, was pretty skeptical of FOFA, and then like got 4 or 5 of his really good amendments adopted, and then
Mhm.
he voted for it in the end. So I think it was great. He had really good engagement, addressed his concerns, and helped improve the bill, and that's kind of engagement we love to see from our members of Congress. Okay, so as promised, we're going to open up for questions. I think we got almost 20 minutes, so that's a nice long period of time. So Ellie, are you
Yeah,
monitoring questions for us?
I am. So we've got some great questions. First is a question about Megafire. What are you all doing to reach out to other environmental organizations that are naysaying FOFA? That's sort of in general, and then maybe anything in particular you might have been doing with the Sierra Club.
Yeah, a great question. I mean, we always welcome every single partner to reach out to us. And that goes for both people who are supportive of the bill, but also skeptical of the bill. And we engaged pretty deeply, I would say, when this bill was on the House side, trying to work with some of our environmental partners to get them there. And we'll say that, we wholeheartedly understand and respect where some other environmental organizations might have landed, like the Sierra Club or NRDC, who are maybe not in support of the bill. But other environmental partners, including the Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, CCL itself, Megafire Action, others have, landed on the other side in support of the bill. And I think it really, we've tried to engage with them. We did a lot of work. Some of our partners ended up joining us on this side, and we're happy to see them. And we're always happy to talk to anyone who has concerns with the bill and try to assuage them. There are some organizations where there are changes to, as I said, the statute of limitations for a lot of the organizations that engage in pretty heavy litigation, and where there might be, a member-driven approach to want to engage in litigation, such as I would say Earth Justice is one of those. We understand that they're not going to get on in support of this bill because it changes a core of how their organization operates. So we totally get that. We just feel that we have a different perspective, that if we don't get a handle, and the urgency of the wildfire crisis necessitates us to start making progress right now in order to change things for tomorrow. That's what we feel. And we've had, very good environmental partners who've joined us on this side who have a very similar perspective as well. But I will say, anyone else who engages with other environmental orgs, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm always happy to talk with you or your friends as well. We're happy to continue to have those conversations, because this has been an iterative process throughout. Where we started, we were against the bill in the very beginning when it was first introduced as a discussion draft. And as we worked with partners across the board, we've improved it. And every single time this bill gets updated, it's been an improvement.
Well, that is perfect because that leads into our next question. Some volunteers are meeting with a Democratic House office that voted against the House version. So, which of the biggest changes might they highlight and feature in those Democratic offices that have voted against the original House version?
That's a great question. And I wish I circulated our side by side between here's what the House version is and here's what updated in the Senate version. I will say that there's so many changes. I will say that one of the things I would highlight is other organizations like TNC, EDF, National Wildlife Federation, a lot of the bigger environmental orbs, they weren't on the House bill either. They joined the Senate bill because of the changes to it. And some of those changes were they extended the statute of limitations. It was 120 days in the House bill, it's 150 days in the Senate bill. There are dramatic changes to the Wildfire Intelligence Center. That actually gives it legs, makes it stronger to serve as a true decision support hub for all of the country, for all stages of fire as well. And some of the things that we liked most about it was the addition of a lot of really good beneficial and prescribed fire language in the Senate bill. And there's a lot of really good community and home hardening language that was added to the bill too. Huge sections dealing with communities that weren't in the House bill are now in the Senate bill. And I think that that was a big concern for a lot of Southern California members as well, who just had these fires rip through Los Angeles and Eaton and Altadena, and we're like, where is the community section of this bill? Well, the Senate saw that and they said absolutely, and they added stuff into it.
Yeah, and I'd encourage people to go through our FOFA concerns document, cclusa.org/FOFA concerns. Maybe Karina can pop that in the chat again, because that's where we listed all of the changes and additions that the Senate made, including the new amendments, the, I believe, 17 amendments that were incorporated into the bill. And so you can kind of go through those and see like which one of these would be most of interest to my member. So like maybe it's the wildfire intelligence centers, maybe it's the regional centers that we were just talking about that were added by Senator Lujan, since those both include like good scientific consideration and also like specific regional considerations. But there's lots of stuff on more tribal engagement, more state and academic engagements. There's lots of different stuff that might be of
Mhm.
interest.
Yes, that is another perfect segue because there is interest to hear a little bit more about the support coming from indigenous tribes for the bill. Anything you all want to say about that?
Yeah, I will say, cannot speak for tribes, and we're proud to partner with a number of tribes, especially those like the Crook tribe that engage in pretty great both prescribed fire but also cultural burning on their ancestral lands. So I can't speak for tribes. I will say in the House bill, the National Congress of American Indians did endorse that bill. The Senate bill, I don't know if NCI ended up endorsing that bill, which is funny because the Senate bill is better, especially for tribal engagement. I think that they're dealing with a lot of incoming at them, so they might have just been an oversight. But I will say that we've worked really closely with tribes like the Crook tribe to try and secure some more tribal consultation language and also beneficial fire language that would allow them to burn easier on their ancestral lands. So can't speak for tribes, but we'll say that they have been engaging in this process, and we think that they're going to continue to engage in this bill.
Yeah, and if you go to our Fix Our Forest training page on community, so if you go to community and type in Fix Our Forest, it should be like the first link that comes up. On that page, we list all the endorsers of the bill, which includes a number of tribal organizations. So that could be helpful information. But yeah, there's a lot of good additions from the Senate version in terms of tribal engagement. Also, as James mentioned, there's more of an emphasis on prescribed burning. So yeah, lots of good stuff along those lines.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Here's a NEPA rollback question. Would you say that the NEPA rollbacks that have already happened have poisoned the well for Democrats to vote favorably on FOFA? And how does FOFA improve on that problem, the repeal of NEPA?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can jump in here, and I will say that um, what the Trump administration is doing regarding NEPA rollbacks is absolutely concerning. And I will say that when that does come up from Democratic members, I mean, the proper response is hold them accountable on that. Like you are Democratic members of Congress, it is your job, it is our job to hold them accountable on what they're doing there. However, the Fix Our Forests Act does not roll back NEPA. Everything that is in the Fix Our Forest Act is already in NEPA. It is just expanding from 3,000 acres to 10,000 acres for categorical exclusions. Categorical exclusions, it's a terrible name, but it is in NEPA and it follows the NEPA process. It was created in NEPA. It is not an exclusion from NEPA, even though it is a terrible name. It is a part of that NEPA process. So I think that I truly think that there's been confusion because of the name of that is an exclusion from NEPA. It is not. It is part of the NEPA process. It is just expanding that. And I will say on that expansion from 3,000 to 10,000 acres, one, that came from a hard fought negotiation with House Republicans. House Republicans wanted it to be a 20,000 acre CE. We argued with them and were able to secure instead a 10,000 acre CE because of two things. One, we had great practitioners saying that at 10,000 acres, that's where you really start to see a change in forest management. That's where you really start to see the impact of the work that you're doing on the ground. 10,000 acres in California is quite small, quite small. And 10,000 acres in Texas is also quite small. But if you start doing that in chunks, you really do start to make a difference. And the people on the ground were telling us that. And then two, Governor Gavin Newsom himself saw how the South Lake Tahoe 10,000 acres CE impacted protections for South Lake Tahoe when the Caldor fire came through. He saw exactly why that happened and he asked for that. In the 2022 Farm Bill, he sent a letter to Congress. We still don't have a Farm Bill, but he sent a letter, long ago asking Congress to create a 10,000 acre CE for the state of California, citing the Caldor fire and what happened in Lake Tahoe as an example of this working. So not only can you push back and say CEs are contained in NEPA themselves, there's public notice and tribal notice required with all of those CEs if you're going to apply them. But Governor Newsom himself asked for a 10,000 acre CE for the state of California. Why? Because of the success of what happened at South Lake Tahoe when the Caldor fire came through. So I think that that's an easy way to push back on concerns for NEPA rollbacks. And at the same time, also say that like you're there with them to engage with what's happening with the administration on a completely different issue, NEPA rollbacks. And I will say that that hasn't given Democrats pause to be able to vote for the bill. The bill made it out of the Senate Agriculture Committee with a majority of Democrats on committee supporting the bill, an 18-5 vote. I mean, in our very divided Congress, it's very rare that you're actually getting both Democrats and Republicans joining together to move something forward, let alone a bill that's on environmental policy.
I love it. Oh, bipartisanship. All right. This is a nice segue into the next question, which asks if FOFA includes funding for auditing after the treatment of a project to figure out if it's working.
I could pass it over to you, Dana, real quickly. It does not contain funding for auditing of that. However, Senator Schiff, who voted against the bill in committee, still secured an amendment, a study amendment that would look at the types of projects that the Fix Our Forests Act would allow, all of the types of forest management projects that they would allow. He created a study that then has to look at those types of projects and the environmental impacts that they would have. So there's not funding for that study that he created, but there is language there to be able to look at, if we are doing something wrong, there is already that backstop to analyze it. However, we have decades of science showing that these projects work. So I'll pass it over to you, Dana, to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say. Senator Schiff's amendment, I believe it has the National Academies of Science do a big study on the efficacy of these kinds of thinning and prescribed burn projects to make sure that whatever is being implemented by FOFA is doing its job in reducing these wildfire risks. So that's kind of a nice sort of scientific backstop to have the National Academies of Science researching this and making sure that it's working properly.
Awesome. All right. So then, in sort of the opposite perspective, do we have examples where forest management projects got stuck in litigation and then that particular forest suffered a mega fire because it hadn't yet been able to be treated, cared for properly?
Yeah, I will say I will give one example, and it may not be exactly related to litigation, but the threat of litigation, I think, looms over very strongly with forest managers. So the one example I'll give is in the Angeles National Forest, right outside Los Angeles in Southern California. The forest manager there was trying to get around an 8,000 acre project on the ground. In order to do that, under the current law, you have to have a environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. They were going through that process. It was taking, I think it took about 4 years for them to really continue to move through that process. They reevaluated, and under threat of possibly getting sued, they said, This isn't working. We have to break this larger project around 8,000 acres into three separate projects." And so they broke it down into three separate projects, all under 3,000 acres, so they can get that categorical exclusion that we've been talking about this whole time. So they submitted the paperwork for that, pushed the paperwork through. The final permit came through for that forest management project 1 month after the Los Angeles fires. And we have a study that shows that if they were able to have the 10,000 acre CE, which FOFA would create, they would have been able to get that forest management project on the ground. We can't say exactly how much that would have impacted the fires in Los Angeles, but the Eaton fire would have been impacted by that, and it may have made a difference. But this is just one example of our current fire regime and the current permitting law that we have holding up projects that we know work, the people on the ground know that they work, the communities know that they work, the forest managers want to implement them. They're already trying to implement them, but it's policy that's holding them up, and the threat of litigation if they don't follow that policy exactly, that's holding them up. So that's just one terrible example, and we have a two-pager that I can also circulate that looks exactly at that of if they had the 10,000 acre CE, they would have been able to get that project on the ground before the LA fires.
Yeah, that's a really good example. There's also a few around the cottonwood fix that I mentioned on endangered species. Like I mentioned, the in Montana it was Canada lynx habitat was burned, and I think there was a couple examples, maybe one in Arizona and one in I forget either Colorado or Utah. I forget off the top of my head, but there are a few of these examples of projects that kind of got held up and then a fire went and burned through, and while they were being held up.
Okay. Dana, do you think we have time for one more question or do we need to stop?
If it's a quick one, we have time for one more.
Quick one is people keep talking about roads that are going to be created in the forest from FOFA, and this makes the environmentalists suspicious of the bill. What's the truth around that?
That's a great question. Megafire has not taken a position on the rescission of the road list rule, which I think that this kind of ties to. I will say just one thing: like there are sometimes the need for roads in our forests, especially a forest that we know is going to have to break out in a wildfire. Now, we're not saying put a road through a wilderness preserve. Absolutely not. We're talking about forests that are right abutted against our communities. So the Angeles National Forest, for example, has roads through it. The other national forests that are abutted close to communities should probably also have fire roads. Now, this is not about clear cutting and paving roads. It's about having the access for firefighters to get into the forest when there is a catastrophic wildfire threatening communities. The policy differences and perspectives on roads in our national forests is definitely something that I think is a little bit controversial. However, we will say, like, on national forests that are right near communities, there is sometimes a need for a road there. And that's not to say that you need to clear cut and pave a road, but to have a small dirt road for truly 6, 7, 8 man teams to be able to get in there and start cutting a fire line when there is a catastrophic wildfire. That can really make all the difference into saving a community. And I think if we're looking at trade-offs, and unfortunately, in the time that we're in with climate change and everything that we're happening, we do have a lot of hard trade-offs. And I think many communities would make that trade-off to have a small road in forests that are abutting their communities versus letting their community possibly burn down.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're
Dana, go
yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, we're out of time now, but thanks, James, so much for giving us some of your time on a Saturday. And that was super informative. And we really appreciate your information about FOFA. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you all so much. And I will just say, please feel free to reach out to me. It's just james@megafire.org. Happy to chat more. I'm in New York and I'm frequently down in Washington. So please let me know and really appreciate all of the work that CCL is doing as well. And the last thing I will say is that at Megafire, our philosophy is really, standing back and letting nature burn is not neutral. It's a choice in and amongst itself that carries severe consequences for biodiversity, for our ecosystems, and for our climate. And we hear a lot of organizations saying, just let nature be nature. Well, we are humans who have impacted the entirety of nature through climate change, and we need to start repairing some of the work that we've already done. So thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thanks, James.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.